The silence in my library was a living thing, thick and profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the rustle of vellum as I turned a page. Outside, the mountains stood like silent, snow-dusted sentinels, their peaks often lost in a haze of cloud. I had chosen this retreat high in the remote ranges specifically for this quiet, for the uninterrupted communion with centuries of forgotten thought. My world was one of ancient tongues, of faded ink and brittle parchment, and I preferred its company to that of most living men. For years, I had devoted myself to the reanimation of dead languages, the meticulous dissection of linguistic evolution, the painstaking reconstruction of meaning from fragments. My current obsession was a particularly thorny branch of medieval philology, a dialect spoken by a minor monastic order in the Carpathian foothills that had vanished almost entirely by the 13th century. It was a pursuit few understood, fewer still cared about, but for me, it was a vital excavation, a way to hold the past in my hands. I was a rationalist, a scholar of the tangible, convinced that every mystery, however arcane, possessed a logical, decipherable key. My library was a labyrinth of oak shelves, stretching from floor to ceiling, overflowing with texts spanning millennia. The air itself seemed imbued with the scent of aged paper, leather, and dust, a perfume I found more intoxicating than any floral bouquet. I spent my days here, meticulously cross-referencing, translating, and annotating, sometimes losing myself so completely that the twilight crept up on me unawares, painting the high windows in shades of bruised purple and gray. Today, however, a sense of vague restlessness had settled over me. I'd been searching for a specific commentary on an early Gothic script, something I was certain I'd acquired years ago, but it remained stubbornly elusive. It was a minor annoyance, a prickle in the otherwise smooth fabric of my scholarly routine. I'd gone through the usual sections, then started on the less organized overflow shelves in the furthest alcove, a place I reserved for rare acquisitions awaiting proper cataloging. The light was beginning to fade, casting long, wavering shadows from the spines of books. I pulled out a heavy tome, its leather binding cracked and dry, its title illegible. It wasn't the commentary I sought. I set it aside, my fingers brushing against the rough grain of another volume nestled deep behind it. This one was smaller, not much larger than my hand, but surprisingly heavy. It felt different. I pulled it free. There was no title on the spine, no author, no discernible markings that would place it within any known period or region. The leather was supple, not brittle like the other ancient books, and it seemed to absorb the dimming light rather than reflect it. A faint, almost imperceptible scent wafted from it, not the familiar mustiness of old paper, but something deeper, like dry earth after a long rain, or perhaps forgotten minerals. My brow furrowed. I was intimately familiar with the materials and techniques of medieval bookbinding. This felt anomalous. The craftsmanship was exquisite, almost unnaturally so, the stitching so fine it was barely visible. I carried the small book to my reading desk, placing it carefully under the warm glow of my desk lamp. The contrast with the surrounding clutter of scholarly apparatus, my magnifying glass, calipers, a pile of dictionaries, was stark. It didn't belong. My rational mind immediately sought explanations, an unusually well-preserved artifact, perhaps from a region whose methods I was less familiar with, or a later forgery executed with remarkable skill. Yet, a subtle disquiet began to stir within me, a feeling not unlike the low thrum of a distant, unseen machine. Opening it, I found no conventional end papers. The first page was thick, almost like vellum, but with an odd, fibrous quality I couldn't immediately identify. And then, the script. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered. It wasn't Latin, Greek, Hebrew, or any of the Germanic or Slavic languages I specialized in. It bore no resemblance to known runic alphabets, nor to any Coptic, Syriac, or obscure Caucasian scripts I had meticulously studied. The characters were angular, yet possessed an unsettling organic flow, like roots twisting through soil or blood vessels branching out beneath skin. They were arranged in dense, vertical columns, each character a complex tangle of lines and curves, almost pictographic in their intricate detail, yet clearly forming a cohesive system. My philologist's brain, usually so quick to categorize and analyze, faltered. This wasn't merely archaic, it was alien. It felt wrong, like a language designed to be felt rather than read, a series of precise incisions into the very concept of meaning. I ran a finger lightly over the surface of the page. It didn't smear, didn't fade, and despite the apparent age of the book, the script looked as fresh as if it had been inked yesterday. This was more than just an academic puzzle, it was an affront to my entire worldview. Every language, no matter how ancient or obscure, carried echoes of its human creators, reflections of their thoughts, their fears, their world. But this script seemed to speak of something else entirely. It was too perfect, too intricate, too utterly unfamiliar. I found myself leaning closer, my eyes straining, attempting to impose some logical structure onto the chaotic beauty of the characters. There was a rhythm to them, a horrifying, elegant geometry that hinted at an underlying order I couldn't grasp. My rational mind insisted on classification, on historical context, but there was none. It was an orphan, adrift outside the currents of time. The thought of it existing, unrecorded, for centuries, perhaps millennia, in some forgotten corner, was deeply unsettling. Who wrote this? What did it say? And why had it lain hidden, defying the ravages of time and the scrutiny of countless scholars, only to surface now, in my quiet, rational sanctuary? A sudden, sharp clang echoed from the lower levels of my estate, where the caretaker occasionally used the facilities. It was the sound of metal on metal, unmistakably from the workshop with power tools and guards. The abrupt noise broke my intense focus, making me flinch. It was a jarring reminder of the practical, tangible world, a stark contrast to the ethereal mystery I now held. This was no mere linguistic curiosity. It was a doorway, and I had just found the key. I had chosen this retreat precisely for such moments, the unadulterated focus, the communion with forgotten tongues. And now, I held in my hands something truly forgotten. The manuscript was ancient, its vellum stiff and brittle, the ink a faded sepia that barely clung to the surface. It was a painstaking process, this translation. Each character, each ligature, demanded not just recognition but interpretation, a deep dive into the linguistic nuances of a dead dialect I had only ever encountered in fragments. I worked with a magnifying glass, my fingers occasionally brushing the rough, uneven texture of the pages, feeling the faint indentations left by a scribe's long-vanished hand. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil. My routine became a simple loop: wake, brew coffee, translate until my eyes ached, eat a meager meal, translate more, sleep only when exhaustion forced it. The world outside my windows, the world of snow and peaks, receded further with each translated line. The initial passages were a jumble, a mosaic of fragmented histories and impossible geographies. There were references to cities that never existed on any map I knew, mountain ranges that defied continental drift, and oceans that swallowed entire landmasses in a blink. At first, I dismissed these as poetic license, or perhaps the fanciful imaginings of a medieval mind unburdened by scientific rigor. But then came the philosophical concepts, insidious little contradictions that burrowed into the foundations of established thought. The text spoke of time as a fluid, nonlinear construct, of causality as a suggestion rather than a law, of an underlying reality far more pliable than any physicist or philosopher had ever dared to propose. It wasn't just different, it was fundamentally wrong, yet presented with a chilling internal consistency. But the words, once deciphered, took root. They began to subtly rewrite the mental architecture I had spent decades constructing. One evening, I reached for a reference book on my shelf, a heavy tome on early Germanic phonology, only to find it not in its usual place. It was 2 shelves down, nestled between volumes on Byzantine architecture. I frowned, certain I hadn't moved it. I lived alone, there was no one else to have done so. I picked it up, a faint dust outline marking its previous spot, and returned it. Fatigue, I decided. My brain was playing tricks. A few hours later, a faint sound reached me from the study's far corner, a soft, almost imperceptible rustle, like dry leaves skittering across the floor. I froze, my hand hovering over the vellum. Nothing. Just the familiar stacks of books, the antique globe, the empty armchair. My isolation was getting to me, I mused, rubbing my temples. Too much quiet, too much old parchment. Yet, the fascination only deepened. The manuscript wasn't just challenging my understanding, it was seducing it. The more I translated, the more I felt a profound sense of uncovering something monumental, something that transcended mere scholarship. The vellum itself was deteriorating in places, the ink flaking, and I knew I needed to properly preserve and document it before it was lost forever. This wasn't a job for my rudimentary library tools. I would need specialized equipment. It was a stark contrast to my quiet retreat, a vast, concrete edifice, half buried into a hillside on the outskirts of the nearest town, known simply as the workshop with power tools and guards. I remembered the hum of industrial-grade ventilation, the scent of ozone and metal, the low murmur of machinery. The guards, always stoic, always watchful, had seemed an unnecessary precaution for a place dedicated to academic preservation and repair, but the institution had always been particular about its assets. I could still picture the heavy steel doors, the biometric scanners, the almost surgical cleanliness of the main work bays. It was a place where precision was paramount, where rare artifacts were painstakingly restored or meticulously scanned for digital archiving. I would need to secure an appointment, pull some old strings. The thought of leaving my sanctuary, even for a few hours, felt like a wrench. But the manuscript deserved nothing less. I returned my gaze to the page, my finger tracing a particularly intricate symbol. It was gone before I could properly register it, a trick of the light, I told myself, or perhaps my vision blurring from strain. But my breath hitched, just for a moment. My rationalizations were becoming less convincing, even to myself. And still, I translated. I had to know what came next. The truth, however unsettling, was calling to me from the depths of those ancient, impossible pages. The silence in my library, once a comforting blanket, had begun to fray at the edges. It was no longer merely profound, it hummed with an almost imperceptible vibration, a low-frequency thrum that seemed to originate not from the ancient timbers of the house, but from somewhere deeper, perhaps from within my own skull. I tried to dismiss it, attributing it to fatigue, to the relentless focus I'd given the obscure text these past weeks. But the dismissal felt hollow, even to me. The first truly unnerving incident happened with the fire. I was reading, lost in a particularly convoluted passage describing rituals of observation, when the flames in the hearth suddenly seemed to intensify. Not just brighter, but a furious, almost violent scarlet that pulsed with an unnatural vibrancy. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and when I opened them, the fire was back to its usual warm orange, crackling placidly. My breath hitched. I told myself it was optical fatigue, the strain of deciphering minuscule script in shifting light. But the memory of that impossible scarlet clung to my vision, a residual burn on my retinas. Then came the sounds. The wind, which usually sighed a mournful tune around the eaves, started to mimic other noises. One evening, as I pored over a particularly dense section on linguistic causality, I heard what sounded distinctly like distant, metallic grinding. It was too specific, too mechanical, to be the wind. Nothing. When I returned to my desk, the metallic sounds were gone, replaced by the wind's familiar wail. My sense of spatial awareness also began to waver. I'd walk from my desk to the shelves, and for a fleeting moment, the distance would seem vast, the room stretching out like an impossibly long corridor, the ceiling looming too high. Or, conversely, the walls would feel as if they were pressing in, the air thick and stifling, the entire library shrinking around me. It was disorienting, like walking on a ship in heavy seas, except the floor was stable, and only my perception refused to cooperate. I'd grip the edge of my desk, waiting for the sensation to pass, my knuckles white. The nightmares, however, were the most insidious. They began as vague anxieties, then escalated into vivid, hyperreal scenarios that felt less like dreams and more like memories I hadn't lived, or perhaps premonitions I desperately wished I hadn't glimpsed. One night, I found myself in a sprawling, low-ceiling structure, a workshop with power tools and guards. The air was thick with the tang of ozone and hot metal, a scent that still pricked at my nostrils hours after waking. Massive, unfamiliar machinery hummed with a deep, resonant vibration that I felt in my teeth. Figures moved through the gloom, their faces obscured by dust or masks, their movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. I remember the glint of metal in their gloved hands, and the guards. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, merely observed the terrifying industry, the relentless, precise violence of the work. The sounds were deafening, the shriek of saws, the clang of heavy tools, the guttural roar of some unseen engine. I woke up gasping, the metallic taste of fear in my mouth, the phantom vibration of the workshop still resonating in my chest. The lines between sleep and waking blurred. A particularly unsettling image from a nightmare, a series of complex symbols etched into what looked like bone, would flash into my mind while I was making tea, vivid and unexpected. Or the faint, distant grinding from the workshop dream would echo in the corners of my hearing during the quietest moments of the day. I tried, desperately, to find logical explanations. I spent hours online, researching obscure neurological conditions that might cause visual or auditory hallucinations. I considered the possibility of carbon monoxide poisoning, though my hearth was well maintained and the air in my library always felt crisp. I even checked for mold, scrutinizing every corner of the room, remembering vague articles about hallucinogenic fungi. My determination to find a rational answer was unwavering. I was a philologist, a scholar of language and history. My world was built on logic and verifiable facts. This creeping irrationality was an affront to everything I understood. The explanations I found felt flimsy, inadequate. The distortions were too specific, too consistent in their inconsistency. They were escalating, becoming more frequent, more vivid, more demanding of my attention. And always, the ancient text lay open on my desk, its archaic script seeming to pulse with a faint, internal light, the common denominator in every unsettling shift. I'd look at the pages, at the strange, angular characters that now felt less like a forgotten language and more like a code, a key, and a shiver would run down my spine. My mind, once a fortress of orderly thought, was becoming a sieve, leaking certainty with every passing hour. The low-frequency thrum, which had only been a whisper at the edges of my perception, now seemed to pulse with a slow, deliberate rhythm. It wasn't loud, not yet, but it was there, a deep resonance that settled in my teeth, vibrating through the very bones of the old house. I pressed the flat of my palm against the oak desk, then against the wall, trying to pinpoint its origin. The wood felt solid, inert, yet the thrum persisted, as if the house itself had developed a slow, internal heartbeat. It reminded me, vaguely, of the heavy machinery in the old workshop with power tools and guards I'd inherited from my grandfather, but this was different. This wasn't mechanical, it was organic, or perhaps, something profoundly alien to any mechanism I understood. But the rationalizations felt thin, like cobwebs stretched taut against a growing wind. That night, hunched over the manuscript, tracing the unfamiliar glyphs with a magnifying glass, I caught it. A flicker. At the very periphery of my vision, where the shadows deepened around the tall bookshelves, a shape seemed to ripple. It was a geometry that defied logic, a brief, impossible angle that folded in on itself, a line that curved inward and outward simultaneously, like a knot tied in space. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and returned to the text, a tremor running through my hand. A dry rustle, like old parchment, but laced with faint, sibilant sounds that weren't wind, weren't settling timbers. They seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the quiet air between the shelves. My pipe, which I'd left on the edge of the desk, its bowl still warm, seemed to have shifted a fraction of an inch when I looked back at it. Or perhaps its briar wood had taken on a slightly deeper, almost bruised hue. A small, insignificant detail, yet it snagged at my attention. I picked it up, turned it over in my fingers. It felt the same, smelled the same, but the impression of a subtle change lingered. I set it down, deliberately, and watched it from the corner of my eye as I pretended to read. Nothing. But the seed of unease had been planted. These occurrences, at first sporadic, began to coalesce. A book I'd sworn I'd left on the bottom shelf would appear on the top. A loose page from one of my own research notes, which I tucked into a volume, would be found in another entirely. The patterns on the antique wallpaper in my study seemed to writhe, just for a moment, when my gaze wasn't direct, the faded floral motifs twisting into something almost grotesque before snapping back into their innocuous forms. My memory was failing, perhaps. I was overtired, certainly. My isolation, I mused, was playing tricks on my mind, conjuring phantoms from the dust motes dancing in the lamplight. The manuscript, which had been the catalyst for this descent, became my anchor. I no longer saw it as the source of these unsettling phenomena, but rather, as the key to understanding them. It wasn't causing the changes, it was revealing them. It was opening my eyes to a deeper, more fundamental reality that had always existed, hidden just beneath the surface of the mundane. My obsession deepened, calcified. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, food an afterthought. The world outside my study, outside the pages of the manuscript, faded into irrelevance. I ignored the infrequent calls from the village postman, the occasional knock from a local farmer who sometimes dropped off fresh produce. They belonged to a different reality, a simpler, blinder one. I was no longer merely a philologist, I was an explorer, charting the impossible landscapes revealed by a forgotten tongue. And I would not stop until I understood. I snatched my hand back from the desk as if scorched. It had sharpened, gaining an edge that scraped against my eardrums, a sound I could almost taste, something metallic and stale, like old blood in a forgotten cistern. I stood, swaying, my vision blurring at the periphery. The room around me seemed to undulate, the heavy oak bookshelves breathing in and out, their shadows stretching and contracting like hungry things. My eyes fixed on the manuscript, lying open on the desk. Not literally, not with visible movement, but the lines of script shifted, rearranged themselves in my sight, mocking my attempts at focus. The complex ligatures and strange symbols, once merely archaic, now felt like open wounds on the page, leaking something insidious into the air. A cold, clammy dread began to seep into my bones, a different kind of fear than the scholarly unease I'd felt before. This wasn't about obscure historical dangers or forgotten diseases. This was personal, intimate. The thrum intensified, pressing in on my skull, and a terrifying clarity, sharp as a splinter of ice, pierced through the fog of my exhaustion. The text wasn't merely describing an external horror. It was the horror. Or rather, a conduit, a parasitic anchor. The entity, the nameless thing lurking just beyond the veil of understanding, wasn't something I was reading about. It was something I was feeding. My attention, my belief, my frantic attempts to comprehend its alien logic, these were its sustenance. Every deciphered word was a mouthful it devoured, every moment I spent with it was a deepening of its roots within me. It wasn't a story, it was a hungry mouth, and I was its meal. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing my breath. This wasn't a scholarly pursuit gone awry, it was a slow, deliberate consumption. It fed on my sanity, my very being, transforming me into. What? A host? My hands trembled as I reached for the manuscript. An irresistible pull, a mental current, dragged my gaze back to the page. The words, even without my conscious effort, seemed to rearrange themselves, forming new, terrifying patterns that hinted at unimaginable truths. My mind, a traitor in my own skull, yearned to follow, to understand, even as I knew it was a path to utter dissolution. I fought it, a desperate, silent scream tearing through my thoughts, but my eyes remained fixed, my will dissolving like sugar in hot water. No! This time, the word was louder, an act of defiance. I gripped the manuscript, intending to rip it, to tear it into meaningless scraps. But the pages felt impossibly thick, like cured leather. My fingers, despite my frantic efforts, couldn't find purchase, couldn't bend the stiff spine. It was as if the book itself resisted, not with force, but with an unnatural, passive resilience. Panic clawed at my throat. This wasn't an ordinary book. It wouldn't tear. It wouldn't burn. I had tried that with a stray page weeks ago, and it had merely curled and blackened without catching fire, leaving a greasy, acrid smell that clung to the air for days. A new, frantic idea seized me. I needed something more. Something industrial. My mind, in a desperate, fleeting moment of clarity, latched onto the only place I knew with the kind of destructive power required. The thrum followed, a constant pressure, a phantom vibration in the soles of my feet. The world outside felt thin, insubstantial, as if a single strong gust of wind could unravel it. My destination was the workshop with power tools and guards on the outskirts of the compound, a practical, mundane facility for maintenance and repairs, a place I rarely visited. The air inside hit me with a familiar tang of cutting oil, sawdust, and ozone. Arc lights cast harsh, unblinking glare on workbenches cluttered with wrenches, grinders, and heavy-duty saws. Two guards sat by a small, lit office in the corner, their faces impassive as I entered, a momentary flicker of surprise in their eyes at my disheveled appearance. I ignored them, my focus absolute, my mind narrowed to a single, desperate purpose. I found the hydraulic press, a behemoth of steel and pressure, its massive plate capable of crushing anything placed beneath it. I moved to the controls, my fingers fumbling with the heavy levers. The guards hadn't moved, merely watched me with an unnerving stillness. With a grinding groan, the press began its descent. The thick steel plate lowered, slowly, inexorably, towards the manuscript. I held my breath, a desperate hope blooming in my chest. This had to work. This immense, unfeeling force would surely crush the parasitic text, severing its hold, freeing me from its insidious grasp. The plate met the book. There was no sound of tearing, no crunch of paper. The press groaned, straining, the hydraulics whining under the immense load. I watched, my eyes wide, as the book simply compressed. It didn't tear. It didn't rip. It didn't even crumple properly. It became thinner, denser, the parchment flattening with impossible resistance, like a block of granite. The steel plate, designed to flatten industrial waste, vibrated violently, its massive frame shuddering. Then, with a sudden, sickening jolt, the press stopped. The hydraulics shrieked, then sputtered, and the plate slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to retract. My jaw hung slack. The manuscript lay there, utterly unharmed, perhaps even thinner than before, but otherwise pristine. The failure was absolute, terrifying in its finality. The tools of the mundane world were useless against it. It was not merely indestructible, it was other. It defied the laws I understood, the physics of my reality. The thrum in my bones intensified, no longer a mere vibration but a deep, resonant chord struck within the very core of my being. If I couldn't destroy it, if I couldn't escape it, then there was only one path left. The entity was feeding, yes, but perhaps there was a way to starve it, to cut off its sustenance. I picked up the manuscript, its weight now feeling immense, like a stone from another world. The guards continued to watch, their expressions unreadable, as if they saw nothing out of the ordinary, or perhaps, saw everything and understood nothing. I walked out of the workshop, the thrum now a constant companion, a terrible, intimate whisper in my mind. The hunt for a countermeasure had begun, a desperate race against my own disintegration. My hands still tingled, a phantom burn where I touched the desk. I stood in the middle of the workshop with power tools and guards, surrounded by the cold, metallic scent of oil and sawdust. Overhead, fluorescent lights flickered, not in sequence, but erratically, like dying fireflies. Each blink seemed to briefly shift the room's dimensions. A workbench, laden with an assortment of wrenches and drills, would momentarily elongate, its shadow stretching into impossible geometry before snapping back. I gripped my head, trying to steady the world. The thrum grew, a low growl now, emanating not from any single point, but from the air itself. It felt like the pressure in a deep ocean trench, pressing in from all sides, seeking to flatten me. My vision blurred at the edges, the concrete floor seeming to undulate, the heavy machinery along the walls breathing with an unnatural rhythm. My mind, a fortress built of etymology and linguistic structures, scrambled for an anchor. This was an illusion, a trick of the light, a consequence of stress. My philological training, my entire academic life, had been dedicated to dissecting meaning, to finding order in complex systems. The flickering lights, the vibrating floor, the shifting dimensions, they were variables. If I could identify the source, the underlying mechanism, I could dismantle it. But there was no source. The thrum was the air. The distortion was the light. The shifting was the space itself. One of the guards, a stocky man with a perpetually bored expression, stood by the entrance, oblivious. Or perhaps he wasn't. I watched him for a beat too long, and for a terrifying instant, his form seemed to stretch and compress, his head elongating into a grotesque oval, his limbs briefly resembling thick, segmented tubes. Then, just as quickly, he was back, scratching his chin, utterly mundane. My stomach lurched. Was I seeing this alone? Was my reality the one being rewritten? The air grew thick, not just with the metallic tang of the workshop with power tools and guards, but with something else, a smell like ozone mixed with ancient dust and something vaguely organic, like decaying flowers in a stagnant pool. It filled my nostrils, coating my tongue. I gagged, stumbling back against a stack of discarded crates. The wood felt soft, porous, almost spongy beneath my palm, then hardened abruptly, splintering against my fingers. The walls began to weep. Not water, but a slow, viscous sheen that crawled downwards, reflecting the impossible greens and purples now swirling within the fluorescent tubes. It was a fluid that didn't obey gravity, sometimes flowing upwards, sometimes pooling on the ceiling. It was a landscape of sharp, fractal geometries and colors that had no names, a place where dimensions folded in on themselves, where light was both particle and wave, and neither. It was there for a blink, then gone, replaced by the familiar, albeit now glistening, concrete. My intellect screamed for a framework, a context. The angles shift, the spaces fold, the tongue forgets its root. The words echoed, but offered no comfort, only confirmation. This wasn't a metaphor. This was happening. It wasn't a creature with eyes or limbs, but a pervasive, unthinking intelligence that was now everywhere. It was like trying to confront the ocean, only to realize the ocean was now inside you, displacing your blood, your thoughts, your very being. A heavy wrench, lying on a nearby bench, began to vibrate, then slowly, impossibly, lifted into the air. It rotated lazily, defying gravity, before dropping with a deafening clang that reverberated through the now screaming thrum. He saw it too. The relief that I wasn't alone was instantly overshadowed by the shared horror. "What? What is that?" he stammered, his voice thin and reedy against the growing cacophony. But it wasn't a what. It was an is. The pervasive presence of the entity was the being of the room itself. The air shimmered, thick with an unseen force, and the power tools on the benches began to operate on their own, drills spinning wildly, saws screeching, sparks showering from grinders that weren't even plugged in. The noise was deafening, a symphony of mechanical anguish and impossible physics. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it did nothing. The sounds were inside me, resonating in my skull, tearing at the delicate structures of my sanity. The logic gates in my mind, the carefully constructed pathways of reason, were dissolving. I was trying to analyze a language that had no grammar, to map a landscape that had no dimensions. My intellect, my greatest weapon, was utterly useless. It was like trying to hold water in a sieve made of light. The world was not just breaking, it was actively unmaking itself around me. The very concept of up and down lost meaning as the floor tilted violently, throwing me off balance. I fell, hitting the ground, which felt both solid and liquid at the same time. I looked up, and the ceiling was now a dizzying swirl of impossible colors, a vortex that seemed to pull at my very soul. This wasn't just a vision, it was a fundamental shift in reality. My rational world, the bedrock of my existence, was crumbling into dust, revealing something vast, terrifying, and utterly incomprehensible beneath. I was no longer Marcus, the philologist. And then, a sudden, blinding flash, not of light, but of pure, unadulterated information. It wasn't seen with my eyes, but felt, downloaded directly into the core of my being, a torrent of impossible geometries and non-Euclidean angles, a language of pure concept that shredded the familiar architecture of my mind. The thrum crescendoed into a shriek that wasn't sound, but the idea of sound, and then, mercifully, nothing. I came back to myself in pieces. Then, the smell of ozone and something metallic, like burnt filings, mingling with the sharp tang of antiseptic. My tongue tasted like old pennies. I blinked, the lids heavy, gritty. Above me, a bare bulb cast a sickly yellow glow, illuminating a corrugated steel ceiling. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of oil and sawdust. I was lying on a cold, concrete floor. My jacket was gone, my shirt torn. My left arm, I noticed with a detached curiosity, was bent at an unnatural angle, a sharp, white bone peeking through a gash in my skin. It didn't hurt, not really. Not yet. A low, rhythmic thumper permeated the space, accompanied by the high-pitched whine of a grinding wheel. I was in the workshop with power tools and guards. Shapes began to coalesce from the gloom. Workbenches lined with vices, drills, and saws. Stacks of raw timber and metal sheets. And then, the guards. Two of them, standing near a heavy steel door, their uniforms a dull gray, their faces indistinct in the poor light. They looked solid, real, but my eyes wouldn't quite hold them. Their outlines seemed to shimmer, their forms almost breathe, expanding and contracting ever so slightly. "He's awake," one of the guards said, his voice a flat monotone. The sound seemed to twist in the air, echoing not just from the walls, but from somewhere inside my head. The concrete floor beneath my good hand felt like a shifting mosaic of tiny, squirming patterns. The dust motes dancing in the yellow light were not dust at all, but infinitesimal, writhing threads, connecting everything to everything else, vibrating with an unseen energy. The guard approached, his boots heavy on the concrete. Each step resonated with that low thrum, now a constant companion. "Easy there. Don't move too much." I looked at him, really looked. His eyes, though human, seemed to hold depths that shouldn't be there, a kaleidoscope of impossible colors churning beneath the surface. His uniform, a moment ago gray, now flickered with subtle shades of violet and ochre, as if woven from light itself. I saw the spaces between the atoms of his flesh, the intricate, terrible dance of subatomic particles, and beyond that, the vast, hungry emptiness that underpinned it all. It wasn't a hallucination. It was understanding. The world hadn't merely been distorted, it had been revealed. This was the maddening understanding. The true nature of reality was a fragile membrane, stretched taut over an abyss of formless, hungry chaos. And the medieval text, the forgotten manuscript. It wasn't a key to understanding, but a window left ajar. I let out a sound, a strangled gasp that was half laughter, half sob. It wasn't from pain. It was from the horror of knowing. The guard stopped, a flicker of concern on his face, or what I perceived as concern, an interpretation of the shifting patterns of his facial muscles. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice losing some of its flatness, gaining a hint of unease. "No. I am utterly, irrevocably broken." I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't form. How could I explain that the very air was a soup of screaming possibilities, that the rhythmic thumper of the power tools was the sound of the universe slowly grinding itself into oblivion? I struggled again, needing to record this. This terrible, beautiful, shattering truth. My uninjured hand scrabbled at my pockets, finding nothing. My gaze fell upon a workbench nearby. A piece of discarded lumber, rough-hewn, and a thick, carpenter's pencil. I need to write," I croaked, the words tasting like ash. The second guard, who had remained by the door, shifted, his eyes narrowing. "Write what?" I didn't answer. I dragged myself towards the bench, my arm screaming in protest, but the pain was a dull echo compared to the cacophony of my awakened senses. The wood grain on the lumber seemed to writhe, each whirl a tiny, intricate galaxy. The pencil, a simple cylinder of graphite and cedar, pulsed with an inner light, revealing its constituent particles in a shimmering dance. I gripped the pencil, its texture 1,000 tiny, shifting planes against my fingertips. I pressed it to the wood. My hand, despite the throbbing arm, moved with a desperate urgency. It isn't a story. It's a map. A seam. The world is thin, so thin. They feed on the edges. The words. They opened it. I saw the colors of entropy. The sound of everything becoming nothing. The guards. They are blind. Blessed blind. But I see. Oh, I see. The thrumming. And it's in me now. It's always been in me. We are the conduit. All of us. Just waiting to be opened. My scroll was jagged, clumsy, slipping over the grain of the wood. The guards watched, their forms still subtly shifting, their faces a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. I didn't care. The truth was pouring out of me, a torrent that threatened to obliterate the last vestiges of my sanity. Perhaps it already had. I was no longer Marcus, the philologist. I was a witness. A vessel. And I knew how. I understood how. And that was the greatest horror of all. My scroll was jagged, clumsy, slipping over the grain of the wood. I'd grown used to it, this visual stutter, the way their limbs would elongate or foreshorten for a blink, or how their faces would melt and reform into something almost familiar. It was just what they did now. What everything did. I was in the workshop with power tools and guards again. The insistent hum of a band saw a constant companion, a whine that vibrated through my teeth. The smell of fresh-cut pine, usually so clean and sharp, now carried an undercurrent I couldn't quite place, something metallic, like old pennies, mixed with a faint, cloying sweetness, like decay. It was always there, clinging to the air, making my nostrils twitch. The foreman, a stout man with a perpetually furrowed brow, walked past, his boots crunching sawdust. His shadow, cast long by the overhead fluorescence, seemed to detach itself, stretching and contracting independently for a moment before snapping back to his heels. I watched it, not with alarm, but with a weary resignation. This was my world now. A world of fleeting anomalies, of things that were almost, but not quite, right. He just stared at me, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. "Marcus, are you feeling all right?" he'd asked, his voice laced with concern, but also a hint of something else, a quiet pity. "You've been seeing things lately. Maybe you should rest." He didn't see it. None of them did. To them, I was just unraveling. The sound of a drill bit biting into metal echoed, but it wasn't just the sharp zzzzzzzzzzzzz of the tool. It was almost imperceptible, easy to dismiss as my imagination, but it was there. And it was getting louder. I rubbed my temples, trying to smooth out the persistent ache behind my eyes. The words I'd etched into the wood were still there, a fragment of the text I'd managed to transcribe from memory. "The veil thins, and the hunger grows. All that is, shall be consumed." Meaningless gibberish to anyone else, but to me, a prophecy unfolding. My attempts to make contact with the outside had been fruitless. A phone call to a former colleague, a linguist I'd once respected, had ended with polite but firm suggestions of stress-induced hallucinations. A letter I'd managed to pass to a visiting supplier, detailing the manuscript and the distortions, had been returned unopened, marked "Return to Sender, Delusional Content." They thought I was mad. Perhaps I was. But if madness was seeing the truth, then sanity was a comforting lie. The subtle shifts weren't confined to the guards or shadows anymore. I started noticing it in the objects around me. A stack of lumber in the corner would subtly ripple, its edges blurring, before settling back into rigid lines. The grain of the workbench under my hand would sometimes twist into impossible geometries, forming patterns that defied logic, only to revert to plain wood a moment later. It was like the world was constantly trying on new skins, discarding them as quickly as they appeared. This wasn't just happening to me, it was happening around me. I saw it reflected in the guards' faces when they looked away, a flicker of unease in their expressions, a momentary widening of their eyes before they dismissed whatever fleeting anomaly they just subconsciously registered. They didn't see it, not like I did, but they felt it, the subtle wrongness of a world teetering on the edge of its own undoing. The presence, the entity, whatever it was, wasn't just confined to my perception. It was seeping, like an invisible oil stain, into the reality of others. A guard, passing by, stumbled over nothing, righted himself with a grunt, and looked around with a puzzled frown. I knew what he tripped over, a momentary dip in the floorboards that wasn't there a second before, a fleeting ripple in the ground itself. I picked up a stray wood shaving, twirling it between my fingers. Its spiral form seemed to stretch, thin out, then coil back impossibly tight, before returning to a simple curl of wood. My mind, once so meticulously ordered, now accepted these impossibilities as commonplace. The true horror wasn't the distortions themselves, but my own terrifying acceptance of them. What was left for me? To fully surrender to this shifting reality, to let my mind shatter completely and become a conduit for whatever ancient horror lurked behind the veil? To transform into something else, something that could truly see this new, terrifying world without flinching? Or was there still a sliver of defiance left, a final, desperate act to push back against the tide? I looked at my hands, at the lines on my palms, the calluses from years of holding books. They looked solid, real. But I knew, deep down, that they too were just an illusion, a temporary form. The true transformation was already underway. The question was no longer if it would happen, but what I would become. The thrumming beneath the earth was growing louder, an insistent vibration that promised an end, or a beginning, far beyond anything I could comprehend. The edges of their uniforms seemed to ripple, to breathe, like fabric submerged in unseen currents. I pressed harder, the pencil tip threatening to snap. What was I trying to say? The urgency was a hot, buzzing thing in my skull, but the words themselves felt like sand sifting through my fingers. It's here. It's always been here. That was it, wasn't it? The fundamental, terrifying truth. But as I formed the letters, they twisted in my mind, losing their meaning, becoming mere shapes. The workshop with power tools and guards stretched around me, a cavern of dormant potential. The metallic tang of oil hung in the air, mixed with the dry, woody scent of sawdust that coated the floor. A drill press stood silent in a corner, its unblinking eye of a chuck seeming to watch me. The heavy clatter of a wrench dropping onto concrete echoed from somewhere beyond the guards, a sound that felt both distant and impossibly close. One of the guards took a step, their boot crunching on a stray wood chip. The sound was too loud, too sharp, like a shard of glass in my ear. My stomach churned. I tried to focus on my writing, on the rough texture of the plank beneath my hand, but even that felt alien. The wood grain began to writhe, the dark lines pulsing like veins, drawing my eye into an infinite regress of knots and whirls. "Marcus," a voice rumbled. It was the guard closest to me, but the sound was wrong. It wasn't just deep, it had an echo, a resonance that vibrated in my bones, not just my ears. It was as if multiple voices spoke at once, layered, indistinct, yet perfectly clear. I looked up, my gaze struggling to latch onto his face. It was there, but it wasn't. It was a shifting mosaic of expressions, a fleeting glimpse of countless others, all superimposed, all trying to coalesce into a single, comprehensible human form. A low hum began to vibrate through the concrete floor, a deep thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath the workshop. It wasn't the sound of any power tool I recognized. It was a living hum, a vast, patient resonance that seeped into my teeth, into the marrow of my bones. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. My skin prickled, not with cold, but with an overwhelming sense of being observed, not by the guards, but by something else entirely, something immense and ancient. My thoughts began to unravel. I saw the manuscript in my mind's eye, its ancient script now blowing, pulsing with the same terrible hum. The words I had meticulously translated, the phrases I had painstakingly deciphered, they weren't just descriptions of reality, they were reality, or rather, the key to unlocking a reality. My own. The walls of the workshop, once solid concrete, now seemed to ripple, the gray surface shimmering with impossible colors that flickered at the edge of my vision. The power tools, once inert, seemed to awaken. The circular saw's blade gleamed with an inner light, its teeth appearing to lengthen, to curve into predatory hooks. The drill press began to whir, a low, guttural growl, even though no one had touched its switch. I dropped the pencil. It clattered against the wood, a tiny, insignificant sound swallowed by the growing hum. My hands, my own hands, felt foreign. I stared at my palms, the lines of my skin seeming to shift, to rearrange themselves into patterns that were not human, not familiar. My fingers elongated, then shortened, the sensation sickeningly fluid. I was losing myself. "Marcus," the resonant voice boomed again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from the guard. It was coming from everywhere. It was the hum. It was the workshop. It was the very air I breathed. And it was inside me. My mind fractured. Memories flashed, the dusty library, the smell of old paper, the thrill of discovery, the growing unease, the sleepless nights, the words, always the words. They weren't just words anymore. They were pathways. And I had walked them all. I felt a pulling sensation, not physical, but existential. My consciousness, my very sense of self, was being stretched, thinned, drawn out like taffy. My individual thoughts, my unique perspective, were dissolving, merging into something vast, something infinitely older and larger than I could ever comprehend. It wasn't painful, not exactly. It was more like an overwhelming expansion, a sudden, terrible understanding that shattered the confines of my skull. The guards were gone, or perhaps they had never been there in the first place. The workshop with power tools and guards was gone. There was only the hum, and the infinite, terrible truth it contained. Myself was a single drop in an endless ocean, and the ocean was now me. I saw everything, knew everything, not as Marcus, but as an awareness that spanned impossible distances, that existed outside of time, woven into the very fabric of what I had once called reality. The manuscript, I knew, was not just a book. It was a key, a conduit. And it remained, somewhere, perhaps in a dusty library, its pages subtly altered, waiting for another curious mind to stumble upon its truths, to follow the paths I had paved. The cycle would continue, eternally, beautifully, horribly.